I'm Nick Muckerman with Earn Do It Yourself Journal. Today we're going to look at do-it-yourself European skulls. We've got an Idaho mule deer that a friend of mine shot that we're going to turn into something you probably would be proud to put in your house. One thing to keep in mind before we do this is some taxidermists will let you trade a cape, if you're willing to pack it out, for services of doing a European skull. That's a great deal. You can also have taxidermists do this who have beetles, which do a better job than boiling, which is what we're doing today. But not everybody has beetles. It's a lot of little critters to feed all year round for just a few skulls. We'll look at some of the materials that we've got. Really, what you need is boiling water and a knife. That's about 95% of the whole thing. But there's a few little tips I've learned along the way that hopefully we can look at and might make the job a little easier for you. There's different materials we'll need for the job. Again, really a knife and boiling water is the vast majority of what you're doing. Here we've got a pretty large bucket that I'm using with a propane tank. That's pretty ideal, especially if you're doing something big. You need like a moose or an elk. You're going to need something this big. For deer, predators, things like that, smaller things, you can use something like this, which is really cheap. Just an electric burner along with these pretty cheap black pans. On these, if you're using this kind of pot, it's definitely good to heat water and put it into it, because if you've got this set up, it takes like 9 years for it to start boiling, so you want to start it with hot water before you get it going. But you can do a deer in there. You know, you have to be a little creative, but these work just fine. Some of the different tools, a drill we're going to use on the back side. I'll show you a little bit. That helps get some of the brains out. Got a few different knives. The little forceps can be quite helpful. Different kinds of pliers, razor blades. The screwdriver is for busting up the nasal cavity. We'll talk about that later. You can save it or bust it up. Depends how much time you want to spend on it and how much you like having that in there, if it's worth it to you. Dishwashing detergent, very helpful. It's pretty much imperative if you're going to do something like a bear that has a really greasy skull, but it is really helpful to use for cutting grease and cleaning things up. Finishing it, you'll want some peroxide. We'll get into that later. You can see over here we've got a couple skulls. The white one, the finished one, my wife got last year, and I did that last year for her. And then this is a buddy's that we're going to do today for an example. The water is pretty hot, not quite boiling yet. The more boil, the better, but it's going to already start working because it's hot. So we're going to put our skull in there. I'm also going to add some detergent, which helps cut some of the grease and it helps break things up. So we've got the skull in the water. It's boiling a little bit. I like to see it at a higher boil. Really helps cut stuff out. But with the hot water, we'll take advantage of it. I'm going to put some detergent in here. There's no magic amount. Later on, we're going to actually dump the water out, reboil it when we get close to the end. But for now, we've got some detergent. We're going to let this sit for a while. Depends how much time you want to spend on it. Once it starts peeling some of the meat, then we're going to start peeling it off. So we'll probably give this 30 minutes to an hour. But really you can start any time, but it is to your benefit to let it go a little longer. You don't want to submerge the horns too much because it can get them kind of white. You'll still get some of the bases white back around here. There's really no way around that. But you want to get them out of the water as much as you can. Here we've got the skull. We boiled it for about 45 minutes or an hour. You do it a little longer, you'll get more stuff off. If you're impatient like me, you can just take it out and chip away at it. But what you're doing is you're getting your knife in there for all the membrane and muscle and starting to scrape it off. And you can tell once you get to the bone you can scrape this big stuff on the back. You're going to cut off. The more you can get off before you boil it, the better. But don't go crazy, because it's a lot easier once you start boiling. So I'm going to spend some time and get some of the big stuff off, get it down to the bone, and then keep putting it back in and repeating. When you get to this point where the nose is, you just want to cut through the cartilage and then out onto the nose where there's actually bone. If it's soft, you can get it out. We're getting close to where we're going to get rid of a lot of that stuff inside of there. But right now we're still at the stage where just keep scraping off the gunk. So we're continuing to get gunk off the skull. A couple things now that you can start doing that'll help is in this nasal cavity, you want to get flathead screwdriver and just start banging things around and really crushing it up. Be careful of this, that you don't break the actual bone up here, but you're going to be wanting to get that in there and feeling things crunch, running it underwater, and then also once that's happening, you're going to be pulling stuff out with pliers as you're doing that, as you're breaking things up. You've also got the same thing with the brain cavity, going through there with pliers. Also the back side here is getting back into the nasal cavity, doing that, again running it under a hose of hard water, and continuing to pull stuff out with pliers. Another thing you're going to want to do that really helps, remember, nobody's going to see the bottom of your skull, so you get down in the brain cavity and you can drill a hole. I try to drill a hole here and a hole here where they're kind of touching, and then and that also helps with, as you continue to get tissue off the skull. You can see here I've broken up a bunch of the cartilage and bone and membrane inside there, also from this angle, and then drilled the holes through the brain cavity on the bottom. So now we're going to run it underwater, hard water pressure. If you're trying to keep the nasal cavity intact and everything in there, it's just going to take a lot longer. You're going to have to pick out little pieces one at a time, and then running water through there softly. I don't recommend it. I say just bust it all out. We're going to take a look at these 4 skulls and talk a little bit about the nasal cavity, whether to keep it in or not. I quit keeping it in. Now I just use a screwdriver and break it apart, but this will give you an idea what these look like. So pronghorn right here, no nasal cavity, it's taken all out. Here, this is a wild boar. I got when I was a kid, and I did it then by leaving it in a bucket with a little water. So this is mostly done by bugs. I don't recommend doing it this way, but you can see the nasal cavities in there. Here's a bear without the nasal cavity left intact, and here's one with the nasal cavity. You can see that bone is just paper thin and really fragile. So what you're doing when you decide, if you do decide to keep that in, is you're just using tiny little forceps to grab stuff out of there and running it underwater, but not too hard of a flow where it'll break all that up. As you can see on this pig's more like a deer or an antelope, how deep that goes in there. There's a lot of cartilage and whatnot inside of there. So it's quite a challenge without bugs to leave the nasal cavity intact on something like this. But if you look at the angle that these would be displayed at, really doesn't matter that much whether it's in there or not, but that's personal preference and whether it's worth the time to you. Continuing to scrape, cleaned out the nasal cavity a little bit. We're going to keep working on that, kind of chipping it away piece at a time. One trick I'd learned right here, you can see this hole is the ear hole. You want to get your pliers in there, needle nose pliers, squeeze it, and then you just want to try to get as much of that out. You can get the whole bone out, and this really helps cleaning up the back of the skull. The back of the skull, as you can see, is like the hardest part. Lots of nasty stuff stuck on there. It's like the deer's way of getting you back, because it takes forever to get all that stuff out. but we'll keep chipping away at this. Here you can see we're getting cleaner. What I have here is the needle nose pliers inside of the ear cavity on one side, and then the other side it's been taken out. So you're digging this in there, squeezing and breaking, and continuing to scrape with the knife and pull stuff with the pliers. You can see where I drilled the hole through here to get more stuff out of the brain cavity, and you can see I flushed out the nasal cavity as well, and it's starting to get more and more clean, and we're going to continue to scrape away at it. Okay, we've continued to scrape and pull stuff with pliers. Also, you can use little forceps, which are nice for getting into tight, small, tighter spots, getting things out. The brain's kind of gross. Also, I've been running it under the faucet as we go along. We're at a good point to change the water because the water is gross, and we've got a lot of it. Most of the things that we need gone, we've got. Don't take too much stuff off of the teeth on the first round, because you want that ender to hold the teeth in. At the end, you take that out, and then we'll put some super glue in to keep it there. But it's starting to look like a skull. Now we're going to change the water out, put some more detergent in it, and then kind of start over. As you can see here, cleaned the water, reboiled it, added detergent, and have given it some time. It's been in here boiling probably an hour, hour and a half. The second time you put detergent in, you're kind of down to some pretty thin stuff, and it starts coming off pretty quick. It already actually starts to bleach the meat that's left, turning it a little whiter. But now we're just going to continue the process of scraping, and more scraping. There's a few types of skulls that need special attention. One of them is the pronghorn. As you can see, they've got this bone under the horn, then the horn slips on over it. When you get a pronghorn, you want to boil it off that day, the next day, very soon after the hunt. If you can't get to it within a day or two, you want to freeze it so that it doesn't dry. Otherwise, you're going to have a really, really hard time. You can't just leave it on and cut around it, because it'll start to smell and get bugs in there. This thing's completely covered with like a skin. It's a really nasty, hairy thing under there. Anyway, what you want to do is boil it for 12 to 15 minutes on a hard boil in a pot like this, where you can get, the horns up to about here in it. If you boil it much longer than that, you can deform the horns. So you boil it, you take it out, and then put it on the ground, get your feet on it good, and pull the horn off. It takes a bit of effort to get them off. You can help by taking a fillet knife, getting it around here before you boil, and then kind of sliding it up into there. But it does take a little bit of effort to get it off. Another thing with the pronghorn, before you boil it, if you want to, you can take a small drill bit, drill behind here, through the horn, through the bone, and that'll give you, when you're finished, you can line it up just right when you put Bondo or liquid nails in there. I didn't do it on this one, I just kind of drop them on. After you boil these off, you want to clean in them real good, scrape with like a long fillet knife, and then put borax, fill it up with borax for a couple weeks. Not only does it help dry it out, but also it'll keep the bugs out of there later. A bighorn sheep also needs special consideration. I'd take it to a taxidermist if you're going to get a European done. But those you can't boil off, or you completely deform the horns. You've got to rot them off in a paper bag or in a plastic bag for, a few weeks to a month, and just let them get really rotten and pull them off. But again, I'd probably let a taxidermist do that if you're going to go the European route with a sheep. Using the drill, you can get in even further up in some of this kind of honeycomb type cavity in here, and it helps you really get in there and loosen that stuff up, and then you run it under a hose, and it helps get some of the flesh off that you need off. Still scraping away and pulling stuff. You can see the hole that I made earlier into the brain cavity, and then taking forceps and pulling junk out of there as you can find it. Also through here, but you can see skull's getting cleaner and cleaner. We're going to stick it back in for a few more minutes, let things loosen up again. So we're pretty much done with the boiling piece and the scraping. Now we're ready to bleach it with hydrogen peroxide. We're going to do a close-up. One thing to remember when doing these is you can't get everything. You do your best to get as much as you can. You can always keep going at it, but the hydrogen peroxide is going to help peel yet more off, and then when you get done with the hydrogen peroxide, if there's still a little more scraping you want to do or picking with the pliers, you can do that. But we can take a look here and get an idea of where we're at with this skull. The back always holds the most stuff, and it's the hardest to get the little pieces. You can see we did pretty clean. We'll get it in some bleach in the garage now. We've got this skull now in hydrogen peroxide, just the normal hydrogen peroxide you get at Walmart. The thing here is to make sure that you don't get much of the horns under. It's kind of impossible not to get a little bit of the back, but try not to get too much. On a larger skull, you might have to, for certain parts or even the whole thing, like a moose, to get it bleached, you've got to soak hydrogen peroxide on paper towels and keep wetting them. We're going to keep this in there for 3 hours, take it out, rinse it, and then put it in the sun for a little bit and see how it looks. There's various options when you're finished boiling, getting everything off your skull for whitening it. I just use regular hydrogen peroxide, put them in for about 3 hours, take them out, and then rinse them off. Be sure not to get the antlers in there or it'll bleach those as well. Along the way I've learned a few things. One, this pig right here, I used bleach and water, and it just, if you use bleach, it gets really chalky and spotty, and I don't like that as much. This is just regular hydrogen peroxide. These are a couple African skulls, a hyena and a blessed buck, and they use like a 60% hydrogen peroxide solution, but that's more for legality of getting the permits to get them back, and it has more to do with sterilization rather than cosmetic. So they also get flaky, not quite as bad as bleach, but flakier than I like. So just regular hydrogen peroxide that you get at Walmart is what I prefer. It doesn't always, this one turned out really nice, pretty white. Some of them a little off-white, but I think it looks more natural than glaring white. You can get a little stronger hydrogen peroxide from a hair salon. I don't spend a whole lot of time in hair salons, so I've never done that. I just get it at Walmart, and it seems to work fine for me. So we've got the mule deer skull all done. Nice European mount. A couple of the finishing things would be, these are pretty stable, but you might want to you can put super glue in the teeth here just to drop on the inside. On a Predator, the front teeth, it's nice to do so that they don't fall out later. We use a 3% hydrogen peroxide solution to get the white. You know, it's not perfect, but it looks really nice. But that's how you do a European skull. The same rules and techniques would apply to any type of skull, large or small. You'll run into challenges with moose and elk, just making sure they fit. You have to get kind of creative, flip them upside down, only put half of them in the boiling water at once, what'll fit. And they take a lot more work, but they can be done just as well.